President Trump, throughout his campaign, he has said that he's going to resolve the conflict in a matter of 24 hours. Now, I understand that may be a figurative speaking, but what is the outlook for the resolution of the conflict in Ukraine right now?
Yeah, I'll say a few words and then turn it over to Professor Dugan. There's no question that President Trump has said that the one issue area in the world, which is Ukraine, that he's going to really fundamentally alter American foreign policy is in that conflict. And as you said, he says he's going to shut it down very quickly. I do not believe he's going to shut it down very quickly. I believe he may have good intentions, but it's not going to happen. And the reason is that he would have to accept terms that Putin has laid down to settle this one that I believe no American president would ever accept. And specifically, Putin has said before he will even negotiate, this is to begin negotiations to come up with a peace settlement, the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States and Ukraine have to accept two conditions. One, that Ukraine will never be in NATO, either de jure or de facto, that Ukraine will be a neutral state, a genuinely neutral state. And furthermore, that the West and Ukraine have to accept the fact that Crimea and the 4 oblasts that the Russians have now annexed are permanently lost. They're permanently part of Russia. And again, Putin is saying, before I even begin negotiations to settle this, to come up with a peace agreement, you have to accept those two conditions. I find it hard to imagine the United States, even President Trump, accepting those two conditions. I find it hard to imagine the Ukrainians accepting those two conditions. Now, one could argue that President Trump is a very special person, and he has views that are outside the mainstream, and he is, after all, the President of the United States. But the problem is that he is surrounded by people who have Russophobia in the extreme and have been super hawkish on Ukraine for years. It's not like Trump is bringing into office with him a good number of people who share his views about shutting down the Ukraine war. He's bringing into power, as is very clear, a bunch of hawks. And therefore, Trump is going to be surrounded by people who are not going to want to accept the conditions that Putin has laid out. So my view as to what's going to happen here is that this is going to be settled on the battlefield, and I believe the Russians are going to win an ugly victory. They're in the process of doing it. And at some point, you're going to get a frozen conflict, or you're going to get an armistice. And the end result is you're going to have bad relations between Russia on one side and the West and Ukraine on the other side for as far as the eye can see. I think this is a terrible situation, but I don't think that Trump is going to change things in any meaningful way and be able to come up with a meaningful peace agreement.
On my side, I can only agree totally with what Mr. Mearsheimer has said, and I would add the situation is more radical that you have described, because the conditions put forward by Mr. Putin officially don't correspond to the real intentions of Russian Federation. So that was a kind of minimal conditions that were put in the front precisely because nobody could accept them on the West. So in the reality, the situation with Ukraine is much more existential and important for Russia. We could not tolerate any kind of Ukraine hostile to Russia, any versions in any borders, inside any borders. The point of agreement, consensus inside of Russia that the war we lead with the West in the Ukraine should end with our victory and nothing less. That is not just the vision of Mr. Putin. That is the condition of Putin to stay in power and to save our political regime. So that is much more than just hawkish or imperialist reactions or desires or dreams or something like that of emerging once again independent power in the Eurasia. It is much more than that. So, and I think nobody in the West understands that correctly, because for us to be or not to be as Russia, as Russian Federation, means to win or to lose the war in Ukraine. That's much more than the conditions that Putin has put forward. And Mr. Mearsheimer has very correctly explained, and I agree totally with this opinion, that these minimal and unsupportable and unacceptable conditions that Putin has put forward, they have no chance to be accepted by the future administration of Mr. Trump. With his agreement or against his will, I think there is the kind of geopolitical or realist, if you want, logic that the West and United States could never, I would say, never accept not only expressed and explicit claims of Russia, but much less implicit claims of Russia that they go much more further than just keep in our possession the territories we have won or neutral status of Ukraine. So Mr. Mearsheimer has explained very well the realist balance of power in this situation, and I think as well that we need to separate in Russian understanding of Trump's administration and Trump's factor two things. First of all, Russia is in agreement. Russia supports eagerly the orientation of Mr. Trump against globalism, globalists, against cancel culture, and his fight for restoration of traditional values. All that is very well accepted in Russia. But I think in the terms of the realist geopolitics, there are so huge contradictions that I would say they stop precisely in the moment when these possible, virtual, probable negotiations start. In that moment, there will be the huge amount of misunderstanding on the deep level of the mutual understanding of the nature of the conflict in Ukraine that will prevent any possible solutions. So I agree once more with Mr. Mearsheimer that the result or the end of this bloody conflicts will be decided on the battlefield. So that will be no armistice, no truce, no peace talks, but rather the weapon that will decide the fate, the destiny of these geopolitical conflicts. And that's beside, or I would say beyond a Russian great impression of Trump. Because Trump is, in our eyes, he is defender of the traditional values, and we applaud that. We totally agree with that. Cancel, as Elon Musk recently has said, cancel culture should be cancelled. So we should stop with this left liberal agenda on the global level. In that sense, Russia will support absolutely that. But on the term or in the realm of the realist geopolitics, I think the contradictions will not disappear, or maybe will aggravate more.
If I can just pick up on what Professor Dugan was saying and make two additional points. He used the word existential threat. And I have long argued that it is imperative from a Western perspective to understand that putting Ukraine in NATO is an existential threat from Russia's perspective. And once you accept the fact that Russia views Ukraine in NATO as an existential threat, you realize just how dangerous the situation is, and you realize that the Russians will fight to the death to prevent Ukraine from being in NATO, because it is an existential threat. It threatens their survival. The problem that you face in the West is that hardly anybody accepts that argument. And they will say that NATO expansion is not an existential threat to Russia. And they believe that what's going on here is that Putin is just an imperialist. He's an old-fashioned aggressor. He wants to create a greater Russia by incorporating Ukraine into it. And this has nothing to do with an existential threat. My argument is you may not think, you in the West may not think it's an existential threat, but what you in the West think is irrelevant. What matters is what the Russians think, and in particular, what Putin thinks. And the Russians have made it perfectly clear, in my opinion, from the very beginning, that Ukraine inside of NATO was unacceptable. It is an existential threat. Nevertheless, we continue to talk about bringing Ukraine into NATO, number one. And number two, if we don't talk about bringing Ukraine formally into NATO, we talk about creating a situation where Ukraine is a de facto member of NATO, where there's a strong security relationship between the West, especially the United States, and Ukraine. This drives the Russians crazy. They view this as an existential threat, but we refuse to accept that. And if we refuse to accept that, and we refuse to take Ukraine in NATO off the table, you're never going to get an agreement. And that's a point I think that both Professor Dugan and I agree on. The second point I would make is that the more we push to maintain a tight security relationship between the West and Ukraine, this is the de facto NATO argument, and the more we talk about a de jure relationship where Ukraine is actually brought into NATO, the more we incentivize the Russians to capture additional territory in Ukraine and to destroy Ukraine. It's completely counterproductive from Ukraine's point of view. It would be in the West's interest and in Ukraine's interest to accept the fact that Ukraine cannot become a member of NATO and go to great lengths to come up with a genuine peace agreement. But because we in the West refuse to accept the argument that the Russians make that Ukraine and NATO is an existential threat, we continue to wave this threat in the face of the Russians. And the end result is the conflict will go on, and in the end, Ukraine will be destroyed. It will end up as a dysfunctional rump state, and it will lose a lot of its territory to Russia. And furthermore, this will be a humiliating defeat, not just for NATO, but for the West itself. So what I'm saying here is that by refusing to accept the fact that the Russians view NATO expansion into Ukraine as an existential threat, the West has basically shot itself in the foot and destroyed Ukraine in the process.
So I totally agree with that. So that is, I have remarked some years ago that the West has finished to think in the realist terms. So what is realism in the theory or practice. So you can imagine not only your position in the balance of power in the international relations, but as well you take in consideration the position of the other. So you can think this way, but the other thinks differently. As realist, you put on the balance both positions and you try to come to some rational solution. So that is maybe cynical, maybe outside of moral, but realism in the international relations precisely that. So you evaluate the real capacity, the real possibility of the other than you, and you take that in consideration in calculation of your national interests. So that was starting from Morgenthau and Carr in the international relations. That is uninterrupted line of realist thinking. And I think that Mr. Mearsheimer has explained it excellently. Everything is completely clear. If you consider Russia as an object in international relations, you could say we need to punish it, we need to put it in the border, we need to overthrow Putin and so on. But if you accept that that is not just object, but subject, so you start to consider, to explore, to study its subjective perspective. And in this subjective perspective appears precisely what Mr. Mearsheimer has absolutely clearly defined as existential threat. And that is so. So for us, you can blame us, you can call us aggressors, imperialists, and so on. But for us, Ukraine in NATO means existential threat. And Mr. Mearsheimer has said one very important thing about the fight to the death. And if the existential threat is perceived as such in the eyes by the subject of the nuclear power as Russia, the death means not only the death for Russia or for Ukraine. The death in the case of nuclear power involved means as well the possible death of the Western Europe or United States. The death means the death for everybody. So, and that is precisely what Mr. Putin wanted to emphasize some years ago when he has affirmed clearly that the world without Russia could not be tolerated by Russia. That is the nature and a deep dimension of an existential threat. If something threatens you existentially, you could prefer to destroy everything, universe, life on the earth, humanity, everybody. But you should save yourself. So the price is in the case of nuclear power with nuclear weapon capable to destroy humanity is very high. So it is maybe you can say so that is crazy, that is anti-humanist or something like that, maybe, but that is moral evaluation of what is going on. But on the level of the mutual realist understanding on what we think to be existential threat. So that we need to take that in consideration. For example, if Russia would invite Mexico in the military alliance with Russia, and Mexico, at the same time claims to restore the Texas and other ancient Spanish territories inside of United States now. So you can imagine what existential threat is it for us. I am not speaking as Mr. Mearsheimer here, we are not speaking about moral, about liberalism, about values. We are speaking about interests. I appreciate very much. I have studied ideas of Mr. Mearsheimer about offensive realism. I completely agree with this line of thought. You could criticize that, you could accept that, but that is absolutely brilliant exposition of what is going on in the reality. And maybe I think the lack of realism will play very bad joke with Trump's new administration. The realism could solve this conflict. Realist approach. When we involve the moral, liberal ideals, democratic values, and so on, we are losing the reality of the seriousness of the situation. And I think that Mr. Mearsheimer has shown brilliantly what is on the stake.